All right, so we are excited for our last Wonderful Works talks of the season. And today we're going to do something a little special. We have Leah Whicker and myself, both from Wonderful Works Ministry. And we're going to talk about some of the most frequently asked questions we get when we do our Zoom consultations. Leah, of course, is our special education consultant, and she knows everything about the classroom and positive behavior support. And I'll be handling some of the leadership development questions. So Leah, what is one question that you commonly hear when you're doing consultations?
The question I get most often is, how do you prevent challenging behaviors in your children's ministry?
It's a good question.
Yeah. So a lot of times I'll start with the basics. So we want to make sure that the kids that we're serving with understand the expectations of the classroom. So an easy way to do that is just give positive language. In this classroom, we're going to have a quiet indoor voice. We're going to have walking feet. Sometimes it's helpful to either use a visual to show that or like writing it out, depending on how old the kids are and if they can read. But just keeping it positive, super helpful for the kids. And always make sure that you have something productive for them to do throughout the time that they're in your ministry. So I find that when there's downtime, that's when a lot of challenging behaviors will occur. So you just want to look through your schedule for the day and make sure that you have something for the kids to do at every time of that day, so that way they are engaging in those challenging behaviors or they don't have the opportunity to. So those are two of the biggest things that I tell people. Also, just having a positive outlook, making sure that you're finding the kids that are really doing a great job and praising them and telling them what a wonderful job they're doing and what specifically they're doing well, so that way the other kids can pick up on that and they'll learn that too. So that's always a good thing to consider as well.
It's my understanding that it's helpful to have visual expectations as well as verbal expectations given. What should a teacher do if they don't have any visual aids like a visual schedule or a first then board? How can they help set some of those expectations visually?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of times kids just learn from watching. So if you have the opportunity at the beginning, before you even start, just to give a few expectations to your students and just let them know, like, this is how we're going to walk in our classroom. This is the level that our voices will be. This is how we're going to take care of our crayons and markers and things like that, and to actually show them or use another student, one of their peers, to show them. Maybe they've had a lot of experience in your classroom. They know what your expectations are and they do a great job. They could demonstrate for the other kids, hey, this is what we're going to do when we take out our markers and crayons. This is how we're going to sit quietly. Just things like that. It just gives the kids an opportunity to see what they're supposed to do, and then they don't have to guess. And that will prevent a lot of those challenging behaviors because they'll know what you expect ahead of time.
Yeah, that's great. I also know you mentioned how important it was to use positive language, and you also mentioned praise. In your experience in the classroom, what have you seen with that? Have you seen that really turn a child's day around?
Yeah, it's definitely a great way to make sure that all of the kids are on track, because the kids that may be demonstrating challenging behaviors, they might be doing that because they want your attention. So if they see as a teacher that you are giving attention to the kids that are doing a really great job, or they're doing what you're expecting them to do, then they'll start doing that behavior because they're wanting that attention as well. So you just want to be mindful of who you're praising and giving attention to. Make sure that you give as many kids as you can that positive attention when you see them doing what they're expected to do, or if you know it's really difficult for them to sit quietly during a lesson and they're sitting quietly, make sure that you stop and acknowledge that child and say, hey, great job. And then they'll learn that this is how I'm going to get attention from my teacher. Instead of them having, like, getting up and running around the room for that attention, they're going to see that, hey, when I'm sitting quietly and doing what I'm expected to do, I'm going to get praised, or I'm going to get that attention. So that will also help minimize that challenging behavior for those kids.
So one of the most common questions I get when I do consultation is, how do you build strong ministry teams? First, you want to start with recruiting, and we usually talk about looking at the gardening approach method. But once you get that team built through recruiting, the most important part is that you can sustain it. And there's a few things I think are helpful for that. The first is, as leaders, sometimes we can get in checklist mode and we can say we need to do this and this and this and this. And it's easy to forget that our volunteers are people first. So I have found the number one thing you can do to help sustain your ministry team is build relationships with your volunteers. Stop and ask about their week. See how they're doing, just as people, not as people who are serving on your team, just as people that need love and care. Because the one thing that we should never forget is that ministry is people, the people we serve and the people who serve with us. People always come first. Have you ever had that experience, Leah? You've been helping to co-lead our church ministry for years now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I just feel like when you do stop and take a minute just to acknowledge the ministry partners as volunteers as people, it just builds a sense of community within your ministry team, and it just makes you so much stronger. And I've had some fabulous friendships form just from checking in with people, getting to know them a little bit better. So it's a great way just to make people feel loved and valued. And you can also get to find out some of their gifts when you talk to them about their day or their week. And we've discovered, specialties that people have that we wouldn't have known if we didn't ask. So there's a lot of advantages to doing that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And with that, some of you may be thinking, well, you don't know, I have 100 volunteers. How am I supposed to get to know and talk to each one? Well, Leah just hit the nail on the head there, is that you're going to start getting to know a few and you're going to learn their gifts. And then the way you do personal connection with your team when you have a large team is you empower some of your other team members that you have poured into to pour into others. And another thing, I think when you are a leader, your best friend is a thank you notepad. Don't forget to send thank you notes to your team members at least a couple times a year, just so that they know you see them, you value them. They are not just a checklist on your leadership checklist. They are people who are valued. Oftentimes I talk to leaders who may say, we have a lot of people who keep leaving our team. It's really easy to blame that on, well, we live in a society where people are consumers or people are really busy. But if you notice that something is happening over and over and over again, sometimes the best thing to do is just to ask yourself, is there something that I as a leader could be doing better? So you want to stop and you want to kind of talk to some of the people who are leaving and find out, what was hard? What was great that you loved about our ministry? What was challenging? And then really listen and see if there's patterns. Because a lot of times it can be easy as leaders to kind of think of things from a leader's perspective and forget that a volunteer's perspective is different. So I found that really stopping and asking, how can I set people up for success better is the next way to really help sustain those teams. Leah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I find that even just checking in with the volunteers on a weekly basis, just at the end of serving, because you and I serve often with our teams. So we have
Yes, we do.
Just also probably another point, like make sure that you're in with your team, you're serving alongside of them. That's super helpful.
It absolutely is. And then my third tip is to make sure that you're also sustaining strong relationships with your church leadership. So some of you watching this today are staff members on your church staff, and some of you are volunteers. Either way, it can be really easy to be siloed and keep your ministry kind of all to yourself and your problems and your wins all to yourself. We really, as leaders, want to make sure we keep that communication with our whole church leadership open and active and growing, because that is the best way as challenges come up or as you need more resources to get there, is to have the whole team together, the church staff, your ministry teams, and the families. We all want to work together with that chains of communication. So those are my tips for sustaining a strong team. So Leah, our next question is, how do you create a welcoming classroom environment?
So you definitely want to be mindful of the environment that the kids are in, because that will reduce the challenging behaviors, but it'll also just show everyone that you are welcoming and accepting of all the kids. So like you thought about it ahead of time and you've done some work in advance to welcome these kids, because if a student, like for example on the autism spectrum, comes in, they might experience sensory overload if they come into a space and it's extremely loud. So we've thought about that ahead of time. We may have noise canceling headphones available for them. We may have the ability to turn down the music when we know that a child on the autism spectrum is joining us that week. Things like that, just that you've thought ahead of time and prepared in advance. So I think that's important, making sure that your space, like between the tables, is adequate enough for a wheelchair to get through. And then make sure that your spaces are also defined. So in the church that Barb and I attend, there's a very large room for a lot of the elementary students. So they have to really think about defining the space so that the kids know the expectation of where they're supposed to be. It can be really overwhelming for kids if they just walk into a wide open room and there's not a lot of defined spaces. So just thinking about that ahead of time is really, really important. You can think about colors on the wall. Some people might think it's great to have like a really bright color. Think it might be welcoming and warm, and that may be great, but it also may be a sensory overload for some of our kids. So we just need to think about those things ahead of time if we can, and just be prepared for those students. And another thing I think is really helpful is if we have like a questionnaire or things available and ready. So if a parent does bring a child with disabilities into our ministry, we're ready. We have questions already in place that we're going to ask those parents, get to know their child a little bit better, and that way we can serve them better. So those are just a few things that ministries can consider in advance just to welcome all kids.
That's great. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. You had mentioned how important understanding the environment is for kids, and that sometimes when it's undefined, that can be hard. So are you suggesting that people can use visual boundaries? And can you give us a couple examples of what visual boundaries might look like?
Sure. So yeah, visual boundaries are great for kids. There are many different ways to use visual boundaries. So sometimes people can put tape on the floor. Duct tape works really well. And then that could create a defined space. We're going to have the first graders in the yellow square or something like that. And then that way they know this is our designated area and we're not going to leave that area. Another way you can do it is you can even just set up a smaller classroom with defined spaces by organizing the furniture in a certain way. So this area where the tables are is going to be where we work. Over on the carpet, you can have little carpet squares or something like that. It's another visual. Okay, the kids know when they're sitting at the tables they're working. When it's time for a Bible story, they're going to go over to the smaller area. You may have a rug. You may just have a different like space or area with little carpet squares or things that the kids can visually see. Okay, this is where I'm going to go and sit during the time when we're listening to the Bible story. Things like that are just really helpful for the kids because it helps them know the expectations in advance and it gives them those visual cues.
Do you think by helping to understand what's expected and where is expected to go, does that reduce anxiety, do you believe, for the students?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How important is it to reduce anxiety when you're trying to prevent challenging behavior?
Well, a lot of times challenging behavior is the result of anxiety. So we want to decrease our students' anxiety as much as possible in the classroom. So having those defined spaces is helpful because they know where they're supposed to be at any given time, giving them the expectations in advance so that they know what you want them to do is extremely helpful in reducing the anxiety for the kids. Preparing them for transition, something we didn't discuss yet, but that's another big thing that really helps.
So Leah, are you saying that just by the way you set up your room, you can help reduce unwanted behaviors?
That's correct. Yeah.
What do you think that means to parents when they're coming for the first time with their child who has a disability to see a classroom that already has some of these things in it?
I think it's a huge blessing for parents because it shows them that the church, the ministry has already thought about them and their kids, and they want to be welcoming and inviting for all kids. And it's a really, really tremendous blessing to them because the feedback that we've received from a lot of parents is that many churches are not welcoming of their kids with disabilities. And so it's really difficult for them to even find a place that they feel welcome and supported. And so just thinking about those things in advance, being prepared for those kids in advance is something that it's just going to make all the difference for those families.
So the next question that I get a lot when I do consulting is, how do we prepare for growth? A lot of times when a church is considering starting a disability ministry or really becoming more inclusive, there is a little bit of fear that comes with that they may be the only church in their community that is welcoming, and they may get more students than they are able to handle. So what I have found is there are a few things that can help with this. One of the things you want to do is you want to start with this inclusion training for all your volunteers, not just for your disability ministry team, but really make sure that everyone in the children's ministry, the youth ministry, and all your ministries kind of has a basic understanding of some of the things that are helpful for disability inclusion. That disability ministry is not a program, it is just an attitude of the whole church. It's the whole family together. The second thing is really to understand what realistically you can provide and what you cannot provide, and make sure you are on the same page with your church leadership. And what that might look like is if you have a one-on-one buddy program or you have a sensory-friendly classroom, you may have times where you've kind of reached your max capacity for that time period, like maybe your classroom is full or you don't have any other buddies available. So you never want to turn a family away. We always want to be welcoming to anyone that wants to come to church, which is why we want to have everyone learn the basics of disability inclusion. But if you can't realistically give a family a buddy, then you want to have clear expectations on that. And it's okay to set some boundaries and to say, if you would like your child to have a one-on-one buddy, we have an application. This is what you can expect. And it may take some time, but we have found that really working together with the families and with your church leadership and having everyone on the same page of clear, realistic expectations of how things are going to work is really how you prepare to grow. So again, we are never turning families away. Families are always welcome, but sometimes realistically, you may not be in a position where you have an extra one-on-one buddy, or you may not be able to give the extra support that a child needs at that time. And so being honest and clear with expectations with that is helpful, but also trying to have other alternatives to help them in the meantime. So whether it's the buddy bags, where they have something that they can take into service with them to help them be entertained or engaged while their parents are in the service, or whether it's even reaching out to some other churches in your community that may also have programs, or maybe even some online options. But we always want to try to meet people where they are and let them know that they are valued and loved and cared for. And the other thing that we have found to be helpful when you're preparing to grow is to also set some guardrails for your ministry. So for instance, if you have one-on-one buddies, you may want to know before you start your program what students may really need these buddies and which students just need to have their classroom teacher have some extra education, who can have an invisible buddy where they're serving more than one student, and really thinking through kind of like parameters to what each student actually needs. So you can make sure that you're getting the resources that you have to the right students who really need them. So that is another great way when you're preparing for growth. So a lot of you guys are starting to plan for VBS. How do we have disability inclusion at some of our special events like VBS? Leah, do you have any tips for that?
Well, I think it starts by communicating with the parents. A lot of times, I think that's what we do when our church ministry is trying to accommodate kids with disabilities into our VBS. We'll just send out a message like, hey, this is what's coming up. Are you going to be around? Just to get a feel for which parents are going to be planning to bring their kids. And that is just a great way to start before we think about recruiting buddies or other volunteers to support a special event. We want to know which one of our students are going to be there to start. Mm-hmm. So just reaching out to parents ahead of time.
Yeah. And with talking with parents, you want to ask some questions. You want to ask, what is it that you have concerns about for this special event that we should be aware of? What is something that may be challenging for your child we should know about? What is an area of strength your child would have, or really an area they would really enjoy and love about this special event? You want to invite them in and really learn to see things from their perspective, and that will help you collaboratively work together to help that special event be better.
Yeah.
Another thing that we have found in the past is that, again, setting expectations is really important. And it's even more important in a lot of ways for special events like VBS because it isn't part of the normal routine. So some of the things you can do is you can take some of the things we use in the classroom and like the visual schedule or the now next ring, and you can make those specially for the special event. So if you do have a buddy who's with your student, they can show them, this is what we're doing now, this is what we're doing next. You can also consider having a practice run through before the event happens. I think could be especially helpful for VBS because you could take the student when the church is empty and say, we're going to start in this room and then we'll go here and then we'll go here until they feel a little bit more familiar, which will help reduce that anxiety before the real thing when all of the activity and kids are there.
Yeah, and also creating social stories sometimes is helpful. Mm-hmm. The parents can prepare them a couple weeks in advance or even like the week of, just every day, read that story through just so that the child knows what to expect on that day. So it'll be different for them.
That is a great idea. The social stories are always helpful. And then the third thing I think that's really helpful with special events and VBS is to really kind of go through like a disability inclusion checklist and kind of look for things before you invite people in. Because a lot of times these events are different than our normal Sunday and they're bigger, they're louder, they're just woo, you know? And so you want to look for things. Do you have bright flashing lights? Because that could be a trigger for someone with epilepsy. Do you have volume extra high or extra loud music? And if you do, what can you do to help students that have sensory processing issues? Is it having a calm space and a person who can take them there? Is it turning down the volume? Are you playing games that would be hard for kids in wheelchairs? You want to ask yourselves these questions and really look at each space, maybe walk through it and ask yourself, if I were someone that was in a wheelchair or had mobility issues, would this work for me? If not, how do we adapt it? If I'm someone that has a communication disorder or autism spectrum, would there be parts of this that would be confusing or overwhelming? And what adaptations can you make? Do you have any more on that, Leah?
Just thinking back to past VBSs that we've helped plan, meeting, like you said, meeting with the leadership of the church is really, really helpful. So if there is a ministry director, just sitting down with that person and talking through that ahead of time is just really helpful. That way your team, if you're planning to have a special education team, you guys can be working to adapt games or events to suit all of the kids that you are serving. So it's just really helpful to get on the same page with the leadership team as early on as you can.
Absolutely. And when you're in there with the leadership team, also keep in mind that sometimes you have to have adapted policies for our kiddos with disabilities. So you want to ask about things like, would the restroom policy look different at this event? Do we need an elopement plan that is different from our Sunday mornings? Kind of looking at things that you may want to have a plan ahead of time and talk to your church leadership beforehand so you're all on the same page and prepared for anything that could happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you have a safety team as part of your church, like getting them involved as well is extremely helpful, especially if you have kids that are have a tendency to elope. So just inviting as many people in as possible is extremely helpful.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us for our 5 most frequently asked questions. But there's one more thing before you go. If you're wondering what is the most important thing you can do as you work in your disability inclusion ministry, it's this: pray. Always remember to keep inviting God in for every step, and He will help you as you go. We are so glad that you joined us today. And just know, we do offer free Zoom consulting. So if you have other questions that you want help with, or you just want someone to talk through with you, please go to our website and fill out our consulting application, and someone will be with you. Thank you for what you do. It is important, and you are making a difference. See you next time.